Hello, everyone. I'm Roman Polnar, and on behalf of Hebrew Free Loans Business Circle, I am delighted to welcome you to the fourth episode of Food for Thought, a series of conversations with experts in our community who have offered to share their knowledge with us. And today I have the pleasure of welcoming Jen Lee in conversation about overcoming financial stress, debt relief, and ways to improve our financial well being and credit after a financial disaster. Now, this is an especially important and timely topic because so many people are facing financial hardships right now as we continue living through a pandemic. A lot of us remain continuously isolated and cut off from our family, friends, professionals, and our broader support systems. And just when we need our support systems the most, it's harder than ever to access them. Luckily, Hebrew Free Loan has been supporting our Northern California Jewish community for over 123 years, and this series is another way to extend that support. Each person we're speaking with is a business owner with real world experience who has volunteered to share their insights and expertise to help us navigate whatever challenges we may be facing in our personal or business lives. So, when it comes to navigating and overcoming financial challenges, Jen is especially qualified to speak on this topic as a debt and credit attorney and owner of Jen Lee Law. Jen is a true expert in debt and credit and has been featured in Consumer Affairs, US News World Report, and other national publications. Jen is an author, an avid podcaster, creator of innovative debt relief programs, and is a valuable resource for individuals, families, and business owners facing financial stress or rebuilding following a financial disaster. So, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Jen Lee to our conversation. Hi, Jen. Welcome,
Hi,
and thank you
Roman.
for being here.
Hi, Roman. Thank you for having me. Talking about my favorite topic, but it's not always a fun one.
Well, it's not, but it's important. And perhaps that's where we should start. And can you tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you do?
Sure. So I am a debt and credit attorney, which isn't really a thing. It's kind of a made up word because the bankruptcy world, which is in the attorney world, what I technically am as a bankruptcy attorney, I have found that there are so many people out there who need debt and credit help that we could have kept from bankruptcy if they knew to talk to someone ahead of time. And so I focus on educating and trying to get to people before it's a disaster and before we have to resort to some of the more drastic solutions like bankruptcy. So financial stress is where that falls into.
Absolutely. Well, as a way of overcoming that financial stress, I know that you have a particularly good friend with you. And can you tell us a little bit about that elephant in the room?
So the elephant in the room has now become the elephant in the Zoom with the pandemic, but her name is Bernadette. And Bernadette, people get it when I slow it down. And the elephant in the room is that more than 70% of Americans before COVID have debt or credit problems. And no one wants to admit it. No one wants to have anyone around them know that they have a debt or credit issue because they think that no one else has the same problem. So you go onto Facebook and you go onto social media and everyone's posting about how great their lives are. They just took a vacation, they bought a new car. But in the background, there's all this financial stress. And they're like, oh, you can't tell anyone I talk to you because they wouldn't understand. And I always tell people, you have no idea because all the people around you who referred you to me have already talked to me. So the elephant in the room is that no one talks about this, and it can be really isolating and prevent people from finding out what they can do because they're scared.
Well, so speaking of that, given how difficult of a topic this is and a difficult time in people's lives, what advice do you have for those folks who are struggling with debt right now?
So the first piece of advice that I give for anyone struggling with debt is to actually sit down and make a list of what that debt looks like. The hardest step is to sit down and write down how much you owe, what your monthly payments are, and try to come up with a plan of some sort, whether you need to talk to someone or not. But the head in the sand or kind of the ostrich, and I know that's a misnomer these days, but the idea is that you stick your head in the sand and try to ignore it for as long as possible, and that actually makes it worse. So if someone's struggling with debt, first of all, make a list, figure out what creditors you owe and what your monthly payments are. And then from there, you can start working through, there's a lot of COVID relief out there. You can work through temporary forbearances. Student loans have all kinds of forbearances. So there are a lot of options, but you won't know which options to pick until you have a list of everything that you owe.
That visibility is absolutely key. Um, Jen, can you talk a little bit about what happens when folks do find themselves in debt? I know that there are a lot of different options available. Some of them can be quite confusing and even
Mhm.
misleading.
Yeah. So when someone comes to me and they have debt, and it could be any number of things. It could be credit cards because you were out of work and had to use credit cards to live on. It could be student loans because you were trying to further your education. There's all kinds of types of debt out there. But usually we're sitting down to see, is budgeting out of it a possibility? Is there a way that we can make it work so that you're paying it off over a decent amount of time, not 20 years of minimum payments on an 18% credit card type thing? So budgeting is always the first thing we look at. But for a lot of people, that's not the great option because they are overwhelmed. So then we start looking into consolidation, and consolidation could be Hebrew Free Loan. There's wonderful COVID relief loans that Hebrew Free Loans offered, where we can consolidate debt and get the interest rate down to zero. And that makes sense for some people. And then we start looking into a little bit more drastic options. Should we be settling debt? Should we be looking at a bankruptcy type situation to resolve issues and get people back on track? So it kind of goes from, okay, what's the least aggressive to the most aggressive option we can pick, and then which one works better for the future.
Well, and I know that obviously our beloved Hebrew Philone does such good work and is powered by such good people, but not everyone in the debt consolidation space has their heart in the right place. So I know that there
Mhm.
are a lot of scams and bad characters that folks need to look out for. And when they are facing challenges, that's not always or necessarily the first thing that their mind is oriented towards. So can you share some insights as to what people should
Mhm.
be looking out for?
Yeah. So when we get financially stressed, it's easy to try to find an option on your own. You don't want to admit to anyone else that there is a problem. So a lot of times, debt consolidation and debt settlement companies take advantage of that stress and that you're not going to check something out. So oftentimes you'll start noticing things in the mail. You'll get a mailer that says, oh, you qualify to consolidate your debt. You can pay it over 4 years and it'll be paid off. But what they don't tell you is most of the time you won't qualify for debt consolidation. They're going to shove you off to a debt settlement company. And the debt settlement company is going to ruin your credit by trying to settle debts, and you'll get sued. And so it's really important, if you're looking at something you've received in the mail or something that you see online, to ask questions like, what are the downsides? Can you give me legal advice about my situation? Because most of them can't, because they're not attorneys. And can you tell me what this will do to my credit? Will I get sued? Most of the time, they put that in the small print on these agreements. And then you find out later when you get served with a lawsuit that the deal wasn't nearly as good as it looked. So I would say use your resources, use your resources in the community to figure out whether it's a good company and whether they're telling you the truth about all of the benefits, but not telling you about the downsides to things.
Just as you were talking about that, Jen, it made me realize that. So we dove in pretty quickly into what happens if folks are in debt and they can't necessarily pay it off. What options do they have for discharging it? But as I look kind of at the bigger picture, right, I almost envision people going through three different phases, or perhaps there are more, but the three that I envision in my mind is things aren't going financially as we had planned. We might have a problem. Maybe that's where folks begin to accumulate some debt. They may not be making the best financial decisions that are good for the long term. And then at some point, folks might find themselves overwhelmed with debt when they don't know a way out. That point, they might not have the resources either. They might have gone through their savings. And then the third phase seems like to be the one where folks can sometimes get themselves into most trouble, where they perhaps start working with some of those bad characters in the debt consolidation space. So, could you
Mhm.
maybe back up and walk us through what are some of the best practices that you might recommend for an individual or a family, before that financial trouble really sets in and then all the way through?
Yeah. So my favorite types of people to talk to are people that aren't so stressed out about their finances yet. I find that I can help and provide a lot of input to that first set of people. They're starting to accumulate debt. They don't want to keep going down that path. And how do we refigure their lifestyle to do that? Most people don't know at that point that they are heading towards a troubled path, I guess. So it's really hard to find people in that space that are worried about debt accumulating. It's usually that second group of people that, okay, now we're a little over our heads. We need to figure out what to do. That's usually when I see them. And even then, there are often options. It's really hard to, when you're stressed out like that and someone's promising you something, my advice is to talk to someone who has no financial incentive to sell you something.
Hmm.
And so a lot of those programs that we're talking about, they're trying to sell you. They're doing a free consultation to sell you on their system. And so I always warn people, if you're doing something for someone's doing something for free, be very careful that you aren't the product as that goes through. So then when we're talking about bankruptcy or not bankruptcy, that second and third area sometimes cross over. Sometimes it's better to stop the bleeding at that phase 2, because they want to buy a house, and mortgage lending is much easier after a bankruptcy than after you settle debts. Believe it or not, your credit score improves with bankruptcy a lot of times. And so if we're looking at the future, phases 2 and 3 may have the similar outcomes. We're just cutting it off early to start quicker, restart quicker, basically. Yeah, so the phase 2 and phase 3 that you're talking about, someone who's a little bit over their head, but they're not quite drastic, sometimes that's a better time to consider bankruptcy than when you're so far in over your head that we can't even protect savings, or you've cashed out retirement accounts, or you've done things that I could have protected before you got to that point. So sometimes 2 and 3, I prefer to talk to someone in 2 over 3 because I can do more for their future.
That's very insightful. I'm glad I asked that question, because I imagine a lot of those folks who may be listening or watching this, they themselves might not necessarily have a financial hardship, but it's likely they know someone that may be going through some financial challenges. What would be the best way to approach that conversation, and where should they send their friends or their colleagues so that they can speak with someone like yourself before they get into too much debt or before they head towards that financial trouble?
Yeah, so it's a hard conversation. You're not going to have most people admitting to you that they have financial stress. Most of the people who come to me are either very close family members of someone who's already worked with me, or through someone who's looking at their credit report, a lender, a mortgage person, that kind of thing. So it's hard to approach the conversation. And I often tell people to be open about talking about financial stress whenever you can, because a lot of people are embarrassed to talk about it. But if they feel that you're open and open-minded, they often will start admitting things. It's really funny when I'm working at a trade show or something like that, the amount of information I get from people because they think that I'm open to talking about it is crazy. Like, they'll walk up and start telling me about their divorce and their financial issues in the middle of a trade show. So I think being open-minded is really important. Don't make them feel like they're losers, because that's the biggest fear people have, is that their friends and family are going to think that they are, for lack of a better term, losers because they can't manage their debt and credit, when really 90% of the country is in the same situation where they can't manage their debt and credit.
Well, and especially now,
so it's a hard conversation to have.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, especially now, given that folks are either losing their income or don't have as much income, they might have bills that are piling up. I'm sure it's a very, very stressful time, and it's difficult to admit that they themselves might be in this situation. And I imagine that one of the other points of reluctance in speaking with someone like yourself is that there's the assumption that speaking with an attorney is going to be very costly. And so if I'm
Mhm.
already in financial trouble, wouldn't that just add to the problem of speaking to an expensive attorney? What would you say to that?
Attorneys don't have to be expensive. So I tell people all the time that there is a huge market out there for people who need affordable advice, and people who need 1 hour of time I charge $199, but it's 1 hour of time basically to go through things can save people thousands and thousands of dollars. And if I can help people avoid a worse mistake because they didn't talk to me, then I feel that that's worth it. So attorneys don't have to be expensive. That's the first thing. And then second, a lot of times our discussion is trying to figure out how to make use of the resources they have so that they can afford the right financial services, the right legal advice, the right insurance, the right mixture of things they need to keep their finances together. So it doesn't have to be super expensive. And usually a good attorney will walk you through how you can afford what you need to accomplish your goals.
And I know this is something you and I have talked about before, but I think there's also a misconception that if someone, or if I have, let's say, problems with my finances or I'm in debt, eh, going to an attorney doesn't necessarily come to mind as the first place. And also, people think that perhaps only if or when I'm considering bankruptcy, that's when I should see an attorney. And there's a lot of
Mhm.
fear around that topic as well. So perhaps you can tell us a little bit and maybe demystify sort of
Mhm.
what options do folks have? Is it consolidation? Is it bankruptcy? Is it all bad? And sort of how do you help people navigate to find the best path forward?
So it's funny that you say it the way that you did. That going to an attorney means you're considering bankruptcy. My Probably 50% of my clients wouldn't talk to a bankruptcy attorney because they've already got in their head that that's not what they need. So that's why I call it debt and credit, because there are a lot of options out there. There's budgeting, there's consolidation, there is settlement. I do some debt settlement when bankruptcy is not the right option for someone. And then there's different chapters of bankruptcy. But what most of my clients have in common is if I called myself a bankruptcy attorney, they have already eliminated that option and won't come see me. So by using the debt and credit, I'm trying to reach people who actually bankruptcy was designed for them. There are people who come to me and we sit down and I'm like, okay, so tell me about what you're facing, what your future goals are, and then I'll figure out what options will help. And I ask them, have you considered bankruptcy? And they tell me things like, well, I don't qualify for that. Or my friend's dog told me something crazy about bankruptcy, or they're going to sell my house. And then I find out their misconceptions were what were holding them back from the actual options that they need. And probably the quickest way to get them back on track. So talking to an attorney before it gets too crazy can also help eliminate attorney's fees in the future. If I can talk to someone for $199 and tell them what they can do with their plan and not need a bankruptcy, that saves them a couple $1,000s. So I like that middle lane of helping people before they actually need a bankruptcy attorney. But I will say most of my clients are benefited by bankruptcy and they never would have known that.
Well, that's good to hear. That's one of the, I think, biggest misconceptions that people have, and it's a scary thought just to think about going through bankruptcy. And perhaps before we move on, maybe you can draw a line and distinguish between personal bankruptcy versus business bankruptcy, because I imagine some of our viewers in the community might have personal debt issues, but they may also be dealing with a small business that is facing some financial hardships.
Yeah, so there's different chapters of bankruptcy, different things that individuals and companies can do, either liquidation. Most of the time, a business itself does not need bankruptcy unless you're a huge, corporation or something like that. The biggest problem with small business owners is they personally guarantee the debt of their business. So, for example, when COVID hit, I have a lot of small business owners who rented space for restaurants and for hair salons are my two biggest problem clients because they rented all the space and they can't open. But on those leases, they signed personally and said that if the business doesn't pay, the owner is on the hook for that. And so if the owner has a house and some assets, then the landlord is suing the owner as well. So a lot of times, a small business owner, it has to plan both for the business, what's going to happen with the business, if it's going to shut down, or if it's going to keep operating, but also needs a plan on the personal side for how to deal with any fallout from the business debts. So there are different options for bankruptcy for individuals and for corporations or sole proprietors. Reorganization plans can be used very effectively for both sole proprietors and corporations. It's just knowing where to draw that line with the business. Are we going to keep that business open, or do we need to have a fallback for the owner when the landlord comes after the individual? Does that make sense? There's a lot of different options for business owners, though.
Right. No, I realize we're trying to keep to a certain time frame, and you can't teach us everything there is to know. But I think it's important to draw that distinction because I think there's a lot of misconception, just a lot of knowledge gaps that exist around debt and options of navigating our way out of it, whether it's personal or business. And just since we're on the topic, I imagine that those folks who are watching or listening to this are already familiar with the work that the Hebrew Free Loan does. And if they are facing financial hardship, or if they know someone that is, they would certainly make the introduction and the referral. But how do folks reach you? When do they reach you? And or do you have any resources to share that folks can either continue learning more before they reach out and just sort of fill those knowledge gaps that probably exist?
Yeah, so I do a lot of educating, a lot of speaking. I'm happy to speak at any type of group. I do senior citizen homes, I do seniors in high school, just trying to get information out there. But my website, which is up in the corner of my virtual background, is genlylaw.com. And I have a lot of videos, a lot of blog posts, articles I've written on there. I like to educate. And then I also have a podcast called Debt Therapy. And the idea is that there is so much emotional resistance to managing debt and money that we talk about it for things that you should have learned. So Debt Therapy is my podcast, and we're in season 2 on that. And again, I'm happy. Message me, reach out. LinkedIn is a good place to find me as well.
Thanks, Jen. And I hope folks that are considering those options would certainly reach out and learn more. So we've talked about what happens during those 3 stages. What if we're getting to the point, oh, we may be in trouble, to we're in trouble, to all right, now we need to get ourselves out of trouble. So perhaps tell us about some of the best practices. Like, what are some of the behaviors that you would try to impart on folks in that first stage so that they don't get themselves into financial hardship?
So there is a lot of talk out there about emergency funds and having some type of an emergency fund, having a savings account. And I know it's very easy for someone like me to say, oh, you should have a certain amount of money in a savings account for emergencies. But it's really important to have something set aside that's not a credit card in case there's an emergency. I think I've seen various statistics over the years that says between 70 and 80% of people don't have more than $400 saved for an emergency. And that's really setting someone up to end up in that phase 2 or phase 3 if something does happen and your car needs $1,000 repair. And the other thing for emergency savings and keeping in mind that you need to save for things that aren't emergencies, having a good budget that goes along with saving for things that you know. Like if you pay your car insurance annually, make sure that you're saving each month so that when the annual premium comes due, you have enough there. So budgeting is a good thing there. And then when we're starting to talk about financial setup and maintaining credit scores, there are a lot of myths out there about credit scores that we could do a whole hour presentation on the credit scoring system. Research good information about credit scores. If you're in that first phase of have some debt that's accumulating, but you're managing and trying to figure things out, know what goes into a good credit score, because that can help you with insurance. In California, good credit score will lower your insurance premium. A bad credit score won't increase your insurance premium, but a good score can lower your insurance premium. And also helps if you do need to go apply for consolidation loan, things like that. And then saving for retirement is really important too. If we're going to talk about emergency funds and keeping things going, retirement savings are really important, and it's really overlooked in this country.
Now, I agree with that as well. And it seems like most people in the country only have money in their retirement plans. And I know that when folks find themselves in financial trouble or in debt, they even consider tapping into those retirement savings just to get rid of some of the debt that they have. So, maybe we should explore that just for a moment. What would you say to folks that might have, let's say, credit card debt or consumer type of debt? Is there a way for them to negotiate with those companies before they tap into some of those emergency savings or into their retirement savings?
So you should never cash out retirement savings ever to pay unsecured credit card debt or personal loans. It's a blanket rule that there is never a reason to do that. The tax hit, the penalties, and then also you lose the time value of money of having that money in retirement. So never tap out your retirement. Plus, your retirement accounts are protected from creditors. So even if you had to go through a bankruptcy or they get a judgment against you, they can't get to your retirement savings as long as it's in a retirement account.
Hmm.
So it's like a golden account to have because creditors can't touch it. Even the IRS has some problems touching retirement accounts. So it should never be cashed out to do that. You can negotiate with your creditors. However, most won't negotiate if you're current on payments. So then you could get into this loop of having to be late and credit score going down, and then you're not going to qualify for consolidation. So it's really good to get advice before you take a step towards trying to negotiate with creditors. Most mainstream credit card companies won't negotiate or settle balances unless you're late. And then also some of them will lower your interest rate down to 0% or 1% and give you a kind of like a term loan where you can't charge on the account anymore. You have to be careful with that too, because that will impact your credit score. So it depends on what you're looking at doing in the future, what you need your credit score to be, because that will significantly impact your credit score if someone cuts your credit line down to your current balance, even if it's a 0% over the next 3 or 4 years. So you can negotiate, but there's some cons to that too that you have to look out for.
How important is maintaining that credit score, and protecting and preserving it, which seems like is one of the most important things, in which case we can't pull on some of those other levers and then you not pay the bill so to make the credit card company come to the table to negotiate. So it sounds like it's a bit of a tug of war. And how do you prioritize which way to go?
So it depends because that's the lawyer answer for everything, but it depends on what your future goal is. So when I talk to someone, just to give you an example, if I sit down and they tell me that their goal is to buy a house in 2 years and they have $50,000 in credit card debt and their credit scores in the 500s because they may have had a few late payments and the cards are all maxed out, which will sink your credit score by 200 points if you have your cards maxed out. Bankruptcy is the quickest way for them to buy a house in 2 years. And so if I know that's what their goal is, then we're going to be looking at how do we improve credit scores? Because most people who file for bankruptcy, their credit score goes up when they file for bankruptcy. And that is not known. And it's one of these huge misconceptions out there. So it often depends on how much I care about credit score, depends on what they want to do in the next 5 to 7 years. Sometimes I have senior citizens who come in, they're like, I don't need credit. I'm not going to ever take out a loan again. I don't want to be in this situation. And then it's better advice than to let things go to collections and we resolve them that way. So it really depends on what their future looks like, whether they need credit or not.
That's very helpful. Hey, Jen, one of the questions that just came in the chat box was if you could provide some guidance on if there's an amount of debt at which point it becomes clear that bankruptcy makes the most sense versus a settlement?
That's a good question. No, there's not an amount. There's not like a flat line amount. And the reason I say that is because it's all relative. It depends on what your income looks like. And a $7,000 debt for one person may be something they can never overcome based on their current wages. Whereas I've had people with $200,000 of personal loans and credit card debt that we were able to work out that way. So a lot of it depends on what their resources are available. I will tell you that the one that I did file a bankruptcy for $7,000 of debt, that was her only debt. We offered my attorney's fees that were reduced to the creditor to settle it. And they declined that. And so in bankruptcy, they got nothing. But I went so far as not to charge the client and offer my attorney's fees to settle it, and they didn't take it. So
That's
They
interesting.
need better decision makers on their end.
Jen, another question that just came in is if you could explain why does the credit score increase when folks file bankruptcy?
Doesn't make sense, does it? So the reason why that happens is because your credit score is an algorithm of how risky are you? How risky are you to lend money to? And a bunch of zero balances on your credit report with all that bad history wiped away is a much better risk than someone with maxed out credit cards to try to lend to. And even landlords, there's this myth out there that landlords don't like people who have filed for bankruptcy. If I've got $50,000 in credit card debt and applying for a new place, the landlord would much prefer someone who's filed bankruptcy and got rid of that debt than someone who's holding all of that debt. So that's why you're less risky.
Interesting. And then on that topic of credit score, can you offer some just guidelines? What's considered to be that credit score where you're going to be seen by companies as being at higher risk that you should avoid, and some very simple tips, if you have any, to help folks improve their score if they can?
Yeah. So credit scores vary widely. At any given time, you can have up to 300 credit scores, depending on who's running it, for what purpose, and what agency they're using to run it through. So you may have a 650 in one system and a 720 in another. It can be that far apart. So part of educating on credit scores is knowing if you're applying for something, what system they're using to run it, and checking your score and knowing what's there. So a good credit score generally is 700 and above. You can get mortgage lending depending on who you're going through, down as low as 580 if you are going for a VA loan or a FHA type loan. So you can get lending down to 580. For consolidation loans and things like that, if you're below 680, they probably won't consider you for a consolidation loan. Improving your credit score, though, is actually not hard. The biggest hit most people have, and when someone comes into my office and they tell me they have a credit score problem, we will look at their credit report and I'll tell them, you don't have a credit score problem, you have a debt problem. Because maxing out cards or being more than 30% of your limit is probably the biggest hit that anyone takes on their credit. So, and that's on one card. It's not across all cards together. You may have a 10% utilization rate on all cards combined, but if one of them's maxed out, it will significantly lower your credit score. So that's the first thing I tell people to look for, is how much of your credit line are you using on each card? And then the second big hit is if you have one late payment, that can be up to 200 points off your credit score. So whatever you need to do to not have a late payment is, if you need to set up automatic payments, if you need to talk to the creditor and make sure that they're not reporting you late. And the misconception there is if you're one day late and you get a late fee, that it's going to be reported as late. It is not late until it's 30 days late. So if you miss a payment and you're like, oh no, it was due yesterday, just go make the payment quick. You'll have to pay the late fee, but it won't ever be reported as late if you're 1 or 2 days late on it. So those are the two biggest things. That's like 70% of your credit score, is how much of your credit you're using and if you have any late payments.
That's very helpful. Thank you, Jen. I'm seeing a couple of questions that are coming in. One of the questions is when it comes to credit cards and credit scores, there is a proportion between an amount that you have borrowed versus the credit limit. And at what point does the credit score get impacted? And so, what should you keep that balance? Because I know people have multiple credit cards that they can shuffle back and forth.
That's a good question. So there are cliffs. So the best is if you can keep it below about 30% of your limit. And then once you get up to 50% of the limit, it'll drop. And then 80%, it'll drop a lot more. And then once you're maxed out is the final cliff on it. So the general recommendation is to keep it below 30%. You do not have to carry a balance on your credit cards and pay interest in order to have an 800 credit score. That's another misconception, is that you have to keep carrying a balance. You don't have to do that. Just use them and pay them off as you normally would on a credit card. Just pay them off each month. That's fine. There was one other thing I was going to bring up right there, that people are often, whatever your statement balance shows, that's what's going to be reported to the credit reporting agencies. So if you're maxing out a card, but you're paying it off each month, it's negatively impacting your score, because all that's being reported is that your card is maxed out. So I have seen people try to spread it out over a few different cards or ask for an increased limit. If you have a card that's been around for years, ask them for an increased limit so that you're not maxing it out each month.
That's good advice. Thank you. Another question that came in asking you to talk about medical debt. How likely is a medical debt collector to report to a credit bureau?
Less likely than it used to be. There are some regulations that were passed in the last couple of years that make medical debt harder to report. So, and medical debt is one of those mysterious things out there that people think that can't be discharged in bankruptcy either, but it can. So if the medical debt is sold to a major collection agency, there's a good chance it'll be reported on your credit report because they have an account with each of the credit reporting agencies and easily report. If it's a smaller local, they probably won't report it on your credit report. They may, but it's best to deal with those before they go to collections. Most hospitals and medical service providers have in-house programs where they'll help you negotiate with the bill. And so those are always best to resolve before they go to collections.
Thanks, Jen. Here's another question. When people are carrying credit card debt that they can't pay off right away, how do you advise them to balance or to pay off the balance on interest-bearing debt versus building the emergency savings that you talked about?
That's a good question because you have to balance like how much do I put towards debt versus how much do I save. I would save up, make your minimum payments and save up some money to have in your account, because what happens a lot of times is people who have credit cards they're trying to pay off continue having to use those credit cards and they never get paid off, and you're a year into it and you've made all your payments, but your balance is still the same. So the first thing you should do if you decide you're going to pay off your credit cards is never use them again. Don't put on $50 and say, I'm going to make an extra $50 payment, because it never works out that way. So make the minimum payments for a couple months and save up $500 or $1,000 just to have that in reserve, and then start knocking away at the debt that you have so that you're paying off principal and not just interest on it.
Good advice. Jen, question. Recently, the IRS started using collection agencies. Was that good or bad news for delinquent taxpayers?
So this is an interesting topic because they started using collection agencies about 18 months to 2 years ago, and they hired 4 collection agencies. And their recovery, they spent like $150 million on these collection agencies, and I think they recovered like 4 million. So there was a huge deficit between what they were outlaying to collect and what they were recovering for. So for most people, the collection agencies aren't reaching out to you unless you owe more than $50,000. They're targeting the big bills, and it's all relative. So I may say $50,000 in taxes. I see that all the time. Some people may freak out when they hear that, but I've seen tax bills in the millions of dollars of people trying to resolve. So those are the ones they're really targeting.
Understood. Thank you for that. Jen, as we come to the end of our time together, is there anything else that you wanted to share with the community? Any final thoughts or resources?
So my soapbox has always been know your rights and options is kind of one of the hashtags I use a lot. If you are ever concerned about something or you think maybe you should find out what you can do, talk to someone. It doesn't have to be me. There are other people who do what I do, but just find out what your rights and options are, because that education will serve you so much more in the long run than fumbling around trying to figure things out. And don't be embarrassed about it, because the guy on the corner who has a Porsche probably has more debt than anyone it's just funny how it all works. There was a meme on Facebook the other day that said, stop trying to keep up with the Joneses, they're broke. And it really spoke to me because it's very true what you see out there. So the stigma and the embarrassment, let that go and talk to someone if you have an issue. And also, if you have good resources and you like this space, I'm always willing to talk to someone if they want to find good programs for people and figure out how to help others that are in a similar situation.
Not judging the book by its cover is ages old wisdom, and that's a good reminder. This is one of those times. And it also, I just want to reiterate, this is such a big space and such an important space, but there are not always good professionals giving advice. And so if if I may be so bold as to remind folks, again, get advice from trustworthy individuals and companies and organizations, and be skeptical, be careful, and don't fall into some of the traps and the scams that exist out there. Because I think, as Jen was telling me earlier, as soon as folks start falling behind in their payments, their inbox and their mailbox gets filled with advertisements, and it's hard to tell who the good guys and gals are. So, Jen, I want to thank you again for taking some time. Always a pleasure. You're a wealth of knowledge, and it's wonderful to have you here today. And I also, before we close, would like to invite everyone for a special opportunity to hear from a very well-known and active person in the Jewish community, Craig Newmark, who's the founder of Craigslist. So please mark your calendars for Thursday, March 4th at 4 p.m. Pacific Standard for a thought-provoking dialogue with Craig that is called From Craigslist to Philanthropist, about his journey from launching Craigslist to founding Craig Newmark Philanthropies. Again, that's Thursday, March 4th, 4 p.m. It's on Zoom. Commutes will be short and plenty of parking. So please visit hflasf.org to learn more and register. There's no cost to attend, but there are sponsorship opportunities available. So thank you again, Jen. It was wonderful to have you. Thanks everyone who dialed in and joined us live. And until next time, wishing you and your families all the best from the Business Circle and everyone at the Hebrew Free Loan. Thanks again.